The north is cold and full of whispers.
The fire in the brazier was small, not dying. Stannis Baratheon did not allow things in his household to die through neglect. Small because he had ordered it small. Fuel was a resource. Resources were not wasted on comfort. The room smelled of salt and old stone, and the faint sulfur that drifted up from the volcanic rock beneath Dragonstone's foundations. That smell had lived in Stannis Baratheon's nose for 17 years, through a siege and a marriage and the slow, grinding accumulation of slights that lesser men would have called injustices. He did not call them injustices. He called them facts. Injustice implied someone had made a choice. What had been done to him was simpler and worse than that. It was merely what happened when no one was paying attention. On the table where his war charts usually lived, there were 2 documents. Not charts, documents. Davos Seaworth noticed this when he entered the chamber. He noticed it the way a sailor notices that the horizon has changed color, not with alarm, not immediately, but with the particular attention of a man who has learned that small differences have large consequences. The charts had been on this table every night for the past 4 months. He could have described them from memory: the coastline of the narrow sea, the positions of the Lannister fleet, the marking of shoals and headwinds around the mouth of Blackwater Bay. The documents were not charts. They had the look of something that had been read many times and set down carefully each time, the way a man handles a thing that has already done its damage. He waited. Stannis did not look up. "Close the door." Davos closed it. "Read them." Stannis pushed the nearer document across the stone. The candle between them guttered, bent sideways, then steadied. Outside, somewhere below the castle walls, the narrow sea applied itself to the black rock, with the patience of something that had been doing this since before men existed, and intended to continue long after. Davos sat. He was not a learned man. He had taught himself to read from a book his wife had given him, and he had never been ashamed of that, though he had never forgotten it either. He read slowly. He read every word. The first document was in a cramped hand, a cipher partially decoded in the margin by someone who had been working at it for days. The decoded sections described a ceremony. A prince. A northern maid. A septon. The words "lawfully witnessed" appeared twice, underlined by whoever had broken the cipher, as though they needed to be seen from a distance. He set the first down and picked up the second. The second was a series of ravens, intercepted and never delivered, the parchment still creased from a folding they had been doing for 17 years. The ink was brown at the edges. The words were very specific about a baby boy, born alive, carried north from a tower in Dorne in the arms of the Lord of Winterfell. Specific about dark hair. Specific about gray eyes. Specific about the name on no document that any living man had been permitted to read. Davos set it down. He did not speak immediately. This was one of the things Stannis valued about him most. When Davos Seaworth did not have the right words yet, he did not fill the silence with the wrong ones. The fire was small. The sea was loud. The candle put both their faces in a light that was mostly shadow. "My lord," Davos said, "finally. This changes everything." "It changes nothing." Stannis's voice was even, compressed in the way that things under great pressure are compressed, not calm, but contained. "It clarifies everything. There is a difference." Davos looked at him. He had known this man long enough to know what the set of his jaw meant, and what it was costing him to hold it there. "How long have you had these?" "Varys brought me the letters 3 nights ago. The journal I found myself, in the records of the High Septon's office, which I requested access to when I began investigating Jon Arryn's death. The cipher took my maester 11 days to crack." Stannis looked at the documents on the table. Not with grief, not with longing, with the expression of a man examining a wound that must be treated regardless of how much the treatment costs. "I have spent 3 nights reading them. Every night I have said the same thing to myself." Davos waited. "I said, I hate this." Stannis picked up his cup, set it down without drinking. "I said it 3 times, clearly, so that I knew it was heard." A short pause, and then I asked myself, does my hatred make it untrue? The sea shifted weight against the rock below. The answer was no. The fire held. And I asked, does my hatred give me the right to pretend it did not happen? The candle leaned fractionally toward the window and straightened. The answer was again, no. And I asked myself what my hatred entitles me to. He looked at Davos directly then, and his eyes in the candlelight were the flat gray of coastal water in November. Nothing, Davos. My hatred entitles me to nothing. The law is not a choice. It is a command. Davos let a moment pass. The boy doesn't know. No, Ned Stark kept it from him his whole life. Yes, and Robert believed what he needed to believe, as he always did. The contempt in Stannis' voice was old and familiar, the contempt of a man who had watched his brother drink and hunt and laugh his way through a reign while the realm managed itself. Lyanna Stark was not taken. The journal is plain. A septon performed the ceremony. A witness attended. She went willingly. Every man who died in Robert's rebellion died for a man's wounded pride dressed in the costume of justice. Men who deserved a more honest reason for the graves they were put in. He paused. And I held Storm's End for a year eating rats while my brother was crowned 600 miles away and could not spare a raven. The weight of that sat on the table alongside the parchment. So Robert's claim, Davos said slowly, was always built on a story Robert found convenient and never questioned, because questioning it would have required giving back the throne. Stannis stood. He moved to the window and put his back to the room and looked out at the black water below. He was not a man who paced. Pacing was theater, but he could not hold still any longer. I have wanted that throne for 17 years. Not for the feasts and the songs and the flattery that Robert drowned himself in, for the justice of it. Because it was owed to me. Because I held Storm's End on rats and boot leather for a year while my brother was crowned 600 miles away, and received no raven, no word, no acknowledgement until the war was already over and everyone had already forgotten what the siege had cost. He turned. I want you to understand what it costs me to say what I am about to say. Precisely, because I will not say it again, and I will not speak of it as a loss after tonight. Davos understood. He had known when he walked through the door that he was going to witness something that would not be witnessed twice. The crown is not mine. Stannis' voice was without tremor. He did not allow it any. It was never mine. I was standing second in a line that had no right to exist. Robert conquered the throne on behalf of a lie, and I cannot inherit what was stolen. The true heir is in the north. He let that settle. He is 16 years old. He has been wearing a dead man's name his whole life, because the man who gave it to him loved him enough to ruin his own honor for it. His name is Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, son of Lyanna Stark, born of lawful marriage, and I am going to sail north and find him. The room absorbed this. Dragonstone's walls were thick. They had absorbed worse. The shivering sea will be rough, Davos said, already calculating. The men aren't provisioned for northern waters. 3 weeks minimum. If the weather turns near Widow's Watch, then they will endure it. Melisandre will not be consulted on this departure. Not yet. Stannis moved back to the table and picked up both documents, rolled them together with care, sealed them with his own stag. She will appear on the dock at dawn regardless. She always does. I will manage her when she arrives. He held the sealed documents for a moment. The weight of parchment, which should have been nothing, which was not nothing. 20 warships. 8 supply vessels. We leave in 3 days. Tell the captains northern waters. Undisclosed purpose. Royal directive. No man outside this room is to know the destination until we have cleared the cape. He walked toward the door, paused, his hand not yet on the iron handle. And Davos. My lord, when we find him. The pause was not for effect. It was for precision. Don't call him Snow. Not in front of the men. Not in front of anyone. A man becomes what he is called, given enough time. We will not spend what little time we have undoing it. He left. The door closed behind him with the quiet certainty of everything Stannis Baratheon ever did. The candle leaned sideways in the draught from the corridor. The 2 documents were gone. The table was empty. The sea pressed at the rock below as it had pressed for 1,000 years. Patient as stone, indifferent to all of it, to crowns and laws and the cost of doing right in a world that had never once rewarded it. In 3 days Stannis Baratheon would sail north to give away the only thing he had ever wanted. He had said, I hate this, he had said it 3 times. And then he had done what the law demanded. Melisandre was on the dock at dawn. She had not been told. She had not asked. She appeared the way she always appeared, already there, already waiting, already dressed for wherever they were going as though she had packed for it the night before in the dark without a candle. In cold water, wool the color of dried blood, a fur-lined hood that did not belong to any beast Stannis could name, her copper hair bound back in a way that suggested she had made a practical decision about wind. Her fires were somewhere else. The lamp she carried cast orange light against the pre-dawn gray of the dock. Stannis looked at her for 3 seconds. Decided, continued walking up the gangplank. She followed. He did not acknowledge it. He had learned, 3 years into whatever this was between them, that acknowledging Melisandre's arrivals as though they required explanation only produced explanations he found more troubling than her silence. She was here. She was coming. Whatever she had seen in her fires to bring her to this dock at this hour, he would learn it when she was ready to tell him, and not before. The 20 warships moved out of Dragonstone's harbor in the gray before sunrise. The supply vessels came behind in a loose column, their hulls riding low with 3 weeks of provisions and the additional weight of cold water gear that Davos had sourced overnight from the castle stores, with the focused desperation of a man solving a problem that has a hard deadline. The harbor master watched from the dock as the fleet cleared the headland and said nothing. He had been the harbor master at Dragonstone since the reign of Aerys II, and he had learned that the questions which produced the most useful answers were the ones he did not ask. The narrow sea on the first day was cooperative. A wind out of the southwest filled the sails, and the fleet made good speed north, staying close enough to the eastern coast of Westeros that the cliffs were a gray smear off the port rail. The men were southern men, Dragonstone men, men who had grown up with the sound of the black water in the narrow sea, and knew salt air the way they knew their own breathing. They moved through their work with the competence of a crew that has served together long enough to not need to speak about most of it. Stannis stood at the rail on the forecastle of his flagship through most of the first day. He was not watching the scenery. He was working. A stack of papers weighted down with an iron cup, charts of the northeastern coastline, notes from his maester on the known hazards of the shivering sea at this season. He read, annotated, and read again. When the wind shifted, and his papers tried to go over the rail, he pressed his forearm flat across the stack, without looking up from the page he was reading. Davos watched this from a distance, and said nothing. On the 3rd day they rounded the northeastern cape, and the world changed. The temperature dropped over 6 hours in increments that a man first felt at his wrists and the back of his neck, and eventually in his chest, a cold that was not the wet cold of winter rain, but something older and drier and more certain of itself. The color of the sea changed. The narrow sea was dark blue in clear weather, green in cloud. The shivering sea was the color of old iron at the edges of a blade that has been left out through several seasons, not corroded, but no longer bright. The swells came from the northeast in long, slow patterns, each one a deliberate weight that lifted the ship's bows and let them fall. Lifted and fell, the rhythm of something immeasurably patient. The seabirds were wrong. Not wrong in a way that could be named immediately. The birds that followed ships in the narrow sea were familiar things, white-backed and loud, the kind that dove for scraps and argued with each other. The birds that appeared over the fleet on the 4th day were larger and darker and silent. They hung in the updrafts over the ships without flapping, watching from a height that suggested they were not interested in scraps. Pip, one of the deckhands, asked the senior helmsman what they were. The helmsman, a man named Cray who had sailed the shivering sea twice in his youth, looked up at the birds for a moment. Northern kind, he said, and returned to his work and did not explain further. Ice appeared on the 6th day. Not the dramatic ice of stories, sheets of it, walls of it, but small pieces, the color of dirty jade, floating in the water with the unhurried confidence of things that had been in that water for longer than anyone on the fleet had been alive. The lookout called them out from the forecastle, and the helmsman adjusted, and the fleet threaded between them without incident. But the men on deck watched them go past in a silence that had a texture to it. Stannis was on deck in every weather. He wore the same wool cloak regardless of temperature, and his face in the cold took on the gray-red quality of northern stone in the frost, weathered and present, and giving nothing away. He ate when Davos brought food, and did not eat when Davos did not. He slept 4 hours by choice, and did not complain about the cold, because complaining was a form of asking someone else to solve a problem that was not their responsibility to solve. On the 9th night, in the middle watch, he found Melisandre at the stern lantern. It was not one of her fire rituals. Those were elaborate and deliberate, and she gave warning of them, because fire on a wooden ship required standing agreements. This was different. She was standing in front of the single lantern that hung at the ship's stern for navigation, looking into it the way a person looks into a fire that has said something unexpected. Her back was to the rest of the ship. The cold did not appear to touch her in any physical way that Stannis could observe, which still unsettled him less than most things about her. "What do you see?" he said. She did not startle. She had always known when he was behind her. He had stopped thinking about what that meant. The lantern light bent against the cold air between them. She was quiet for long enough that the ship groaned across a deep swell and settled again, and the wake behind them spread white in the darkness. "Snow," she said. He looked at the black water around them, at the ice fragments passing alongside the hull. "We are sailing into winter. Speak plainly or do not speak." She turned then. Her eyes in the lantern light were darker than usual, the red in them pushed back behind something he could not classify. He had seen Melisandre afraid exactly once, in the early days of their association, when she had looked into a great fire and seen something she would not describe. She had not been afraid since. What was on her face now was not fear. It was the expression of a person who has been looking at a familiar problem for a long time, and has just understood that they have been looking at it from the wrong direction. "Not weather, my lord." She looked back at the lantern as though she could not fully commit to leaving it. "A face. I have seen it before, in my flames, many times, and I did not know what I was looking at. I thought I was seeing the cold. The enemy. The darkness that the Lord of Light sends his champion to burn away." She paused. "I was not." Stannis studied her for a moment. "You are telling me this because it will be important that you know I was not certain," she said. "When you believe you are seeing one thing and discover you are seeing another, the moment of correction matters. I am telling you the moment of my correction." She did not name the face. He did not ask her to. They were both operating by unspoken agreement, in the vocabulary of what could be said on a ship's deck in the dark without becoming something that could not be unsaid. He went back to his charts. On the 21st day, Eastwatch by the sea came out of the morning haze like a rumor that had turned out to be true. It was smaller than anything the men had expected. The wall itself announced itself first. 700 feet of ice rising from the coastline in the north like something that had been grown rather than built. Blue-white where the sun hit it, gray where it didn't, enormous in the way that things are enormous when no scale exists to prepare you for them. The fleet slowed without Stannis giving the order, because the ship's pilots had stopped looking at their heading and were looking at the wall, and their hands had adjusted the sails by instinct while their attention was somewhere else. Eastwatch was where the wall met the water. A gate, low and ancient, in black stone. A tower. A small dock. Everything about it said, "This is the end of the world." And we know it. The fleet anchored in a harbor that was barely deep enough for the draft of the largest warships, the hulls hanging over rock in places, and the men on deck looked at the ice edge and the wall above it, and were quiet, in the particular way of men who have arrived somewhere that has made the place they came from feel very far away. A door in the black stone opened. 20 men came out onto the dock in black cloaks, bows strung, not pointing yet, but strung. Their captain, Cotter Pike, short, wide, gray-bearded, with eyes the color of the sea behind the fleet, stood at the end of the dock, and looked at 28 ships and their flags, and did not move. Stannis descended the gangplank in full armor. The crowned stag on his breastplate caught what light there was. He walked to the end of the dock and stopped 6 feet from Pike and waited. He was very good at waiting. Pike looked at the armor, looked at the flag, looked at Stannis's face, which gave him no more than the armor had. "I am Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone," Stannis said. "I require an escort to Castle Black. You will provide it. Or you will explain to your Lord Commander why you turned away the only man in Westeros who remembers the Night's Watch exists." The sound of the sea filled the space where a response would eventually come from. Pike looked at the fleet behind Stannis. He looked at his 20 men. He did the mathematics available to him and arrived at the only answer the numbers permitted. The bows came down. Word had run ahead on a horse. One of Cotter Pike's men had ridden the length of the wall's interior road through the night, arriving at Castle Black 4 hours before Stannis's escort, and what he said when he arrived produced the particular kind of silence that spreads through a place the way cold spreads through stone, not all at once, but room by room, man by man, until there is nothing in the building that has not been touched by it. By the time Stannis rode through the Castle Black gate in the early gray of morning, every man in the garrison was in the yard. Not by order, not by summons. They had simply come out, the way men come out when they understand that something is happening that they will be asked about for the rest of their lives, and they do not want to have been the man who stayed indoors. 300 black cloaks in the gray light, rangers and stewards and builders, and the older men who had stopped distinguishing between those categories decades ago. They stood without formation. The Night's Watch was not an army that arranged itself for inspection, in the rough cluster of men who have gathered to see something and do not know precisely what they are about to see. Jorah Mormont stood at the center of the yard, with the composure of a man who had been Lord Commander long enough to have seen the various shapes that catastrophe arrives in, and had learned to hold his face still while he assessed which shape this was. His raven was on his shoulder, black against black, its head swiveling with more apparent curiosity than Mormont's face showed. Stannis entered on horseback and dismounted before anyone could offer to hold his animal. He handed the reins sideways without looking at the man who took them. He stood in the yard and he scanned it. He was looking for something. He found it. Jon Snow was at the back of the crowd, half in armor, a training sword hanging from one hand. He had been at morning drills when the word came, and had not gone back to his room for the rest of his kit, and so he stood there in a quilted undercoat and his boots, and the padded gauntlets of someone who had been striking a post for an hour before being interrupted, and he was the only man in the yard not looking at Stannis. He was looking at the ground 3 feet in front of him. Sam Tarly was beside him, breathing audibly. Pip and Gren flanked Sam. None of them were speaking. They were all looking at Stannis. Jon was not. Jon's hands knew something was wrong before the rest of him did. They had gone still around the training sword in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Stannis walked through the yard. Men moved for him without being asked. He passed Mormont without acknowledging him, and Mormont let him pass, because Mormont had been a soldier long enough to know when a man is moving through a space toward a specific destination, and stopping him would only cost time rather than change the outcome. He stopped 3 feet from Jon Snow. Jon looked up. Stannis studied him. The dark hair, close cut, the kind of hair that belonged north of the neck and nowhere else, the gray eyes, the long stark jaw, the face of 100 men buried in the crypts beneath Winterfell, distilled into one. He looked for the Targaryen in it the way a man looks for gold in a riverbed, methodically, without assumption. He did not find it where he expected to find it, in the coloring or the features. He found it in the eyes, not their color, their quality, the stillness in them, the depth that made men uncomfortable in a way they could not name. "Jon Snow," Stannis said. "My lord." Jon did not bow. He had no particular reason to defer to a lord he had never met. And Ned Stark had taught him that a man does not lower himself until he understands what he is lowering himself for. "You are not Jon Snow." Jon held his gaze. "I have been Jon Snow my whole life, my lord." "Then your whole life has been a kind lie." Stannis reached inside his cloak and produced the 2 documents, rolled and sealed with the stag. He held them out. Told by a man who loved you more than you knew. Jon took them. He did not know why he took them. His hands accepted them while the rest of him was still processing the previous sentence. The yard was absolutely without sound. Stannis looked at him for one more second, and then, without theater, without announcement, without any of the ceremony that the act might have been assumed to require, he went to one knee, then the other. His gauntleted fist rested on his bent leg. His spine was straight. He looked up at Jon Snow with the gray eyes of a man who has calculated everything available to him and arrived at this position as the only mathematically defensible outcome. Jon stared at him. He had not opened the documents. He did not know what they contained. He was standing in the yard of Castle Black at dawn, with a training sword in one hand and a sealed letter in the other, and the most powerful man he had ever been in proximity to was kneeling in front of him in the dirt, and every man in the yard was watching, and his stomach had gone to stone. A sound at the far edge of the crowd. A shuffling. Men moving aside. Maester Aemon came through the gap they made for him. He was very old and moved with the economy of a man who has learned that each movement costs something and has budgeted accordingly. Sam had him by one arm, face pale, eyes red, and he was guiding the ancient maester forward with the care of someone transporting something that cannot be replaced. Aemon could not see. He had not been able to see for decades. But he had heard the silence in the yard, and he knew what a silence like this one meant, the same way he knew the sound of a raven's wings before the bird arrived, by something in the air that preceded the thing itself. Sam brought him to Jon. Aemon reached up and put both hands on Jon's face. Ancient hands, thin as parchment over the machinery of the bones beneath, warm despite the cold. He held Jon's face the way a man holds a map, not gripping, just present, reading by touch what the eyes could no longer provide. The yard did not breathe. Aemon was quiet for a very long time. The raven on Mormont's shoulder made a sound, and Mormont's hand went up, and the raven stopped. You have the Targaryen brow. A pause, the ancient fingers still against Jon's face, the one that comes through certain men of the line and not others. Your father had it. Maekar had it, centuries back, the kind of brow that makes a man look as though he has already decided something before the conversation has started. Old Egg had it too. Though he hid it under an urchin's cut for years and pretended otherwise, he moved his thumbs slightly, tracing, and your father's eyes. Rhaegar had eyes like winter water. I used to watch him read in the library at King's Landing when he was very young, and think that he looked like he was always looking at something past the words on the page. He paused. I never told him his eyes were beautiful. It seemed a strange thing to tell a grown man. I have regretted it since Summerhall. He lowered his hands. He stepped back once. He was crying, very quietly, the way men cry when they have been holding something for a very long time and have simply run out of the strength to hold it anymore. Barely any movement, just the slow track of it down the face, no sound. Forgive me, Your Grace, Aemon said. I thought I was the last. Jon opened his mouth. Closed it. He looked at the documents in his hands. He looked at Stannis, still kneeling. He looked at Aemon, who had turned his blind face toward him with the expression of a man who has just, at the very end of a very long life, been permitted to put something down. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Get up." Stannis rose. I need to read these, Jon said. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who is maintaining level with effort, the way you maintain level on a ship's deck when the sea is working against you. I need somewhere quiet. Mormont spoke for the first time. The Lord Commander's Tower. Top floor. No one will disturb you. Jon looked at him. Something moved through his face that was not gratitude and was not anger and was not anything Jon Snow had felt before, because it was the expression of a man who is beginning to understand, against his will, that the room he is standing in is much smaller than the room he is about to be put in. He walked through the yard. The men moved for him. He did not look at any of them. The room at the top of the tower was small and cold, and contained a desk, a chair, a window that faced north and west, and nothing else of significance. Jon sat at the desk with the 2 documents open in front of him, and read them the way he read everything, completely, carefully from beginning to end, and then from beginning again. He was his father's son, in this the way he was his father's son in most things, and Ned Stark had taught him that a man who skims a document and acts on what he thinks he read is a man who has simply chosen to be surprised later. He read the journal twice. He read the intercepted ravens 3 times. When he was finished, he put both documents down on the desk and pressed his palms flat against the wood and looked at the wall through the window. The wall at distance was the color of the sky above it, which was the particular blue of very early morning that had not yet decided to be day. The ice caught light the way ice catches light, not reflecting it cleanly, but containing it, holding it inside itself, so that the wall seemed to glow from somewhere within, rather than from the sun upon it. He thought about Ned Stark's face. He had been thinking about Ned Stark's face since the moment Stannis had said a kind lie, told by a man who loved you more than you knew, and he had not been able to stop. He thought about all the times in his life when he had looked at his father's face and thought he was seeing guilt, the guilt of a man who had dishonored his wife and would not name the woman he had dishonored her with, and understood now that what he had been looking at was something else entirely. Something that had no name, that Jon had been given the vocabulary for yet. He was angry about this. Not at Ned. He was trying to be angry at Ned, and it was not working, which made him angrier. A man is allowed to be angry when his name has been taken from him. He was being very reasonable about this. He was 16 years old and had spent every one of those years as one specific person and was being asked, in a yard at dawn, to simply replace that person with another. And he found that the person who was supposed to do the replacing was not available, because he had never been real. He was not Aegon Targaryen. He did not know how to be Aegon Targaryen. He had never met anyone by that name. He had no memory that belonged to that name, no morning, no training session, no meal eaten at a table with family. Nothing, but he knew what it felt like to stand in Winterfell's yard in the early morning with frost on the ground and a sword in his hand. He knew the sound of the godswood and wind. He knew the smell of Ned Stark's study, old leather and cold stone, and the particular ink his father used that had a faint sweetness to it. He knew every path in the Wolfswood by the angle of light through the canopy. He was the son of Lyanna Stark. He knew how to be that. He looked at the wall until it became merely ice again, enormous and present and indifferent. Outside, 300 men in black cloaks were standing in a yard, waiting for him to tell them what to do next. He was not ready for that. He picked up the documents, rolled them carefully, and held them in both hands for a moment. Then he stood. The raven arrived at the 3rd hour of the morning watch. It came in from the south, which meant it had been flying through the dark, which meant whoever sent it had not waited for dawn, which meant it was the kind of news that does not improve by waiting. The night brother on rookery duty heard it before he saw it, the particular heavy sound of a bird that has been flying hard and long and lands without grace, and he unrolled the message by the light of his single candle, and read it once, and then went immediately to find Lord Commander Mormont, and did not stop for his cloak. Mormont read it. He looked at it for a moment the way a man looks at a wound before deciding how to describe it to the person it belongs to. Then he walked to Stannis' quarters. Stannis was already awake. He was always already awake at the 3rd hour. Whether he slept at all was a matter his household had stopped speculating about. Mormont gave him the message without introduction. Stannis read it standing up, his back straight, his face doing what Stannis' face did. Nothing visible, everything processed. He folded it once. Where is the boy? His room. He slept 3 hours. I had a man watch the door. Wake him. Jon opened the door before the knock finished. He had not been asleep either, but for different reasons. He was dressed, his boots on, the training sword still on its hook, which was the only indication that he had decided, at some point in the night, not to go anywhere. He looked at Stannis' face and understood before Stannis spoke that whatever was about to be said was not going to give him anything he wanted. "Your father is in the black cells of the Red Keep," Stannis said. "Arrested on the order of the Queen Regent. The charge is treason." The word hit the room and stayed in it. Jon's hands were at his sides. They did not move. His face did not change in any way that a man watching from outside the room would have been able to describe with confidence. What was happening somewhere behind his eyes. Behind that quality of stillness that Stannis had noticed in the yard and was learning to read as the thing that replaced, in this particular person, all the visible demonstrations of feeling that other men relied on. "They'll kill him," Jon said. "Not yet." Stannis came into the room and closed the door. "He is worth more alive. Joffrey is a child and a bastard, but the men advising him are neither. They understand that a live prisoner is leverage. A dead one is a grievance. They will use him to prevent exactly what we are doing, which is moving quickly." Yes. Jon looked at the window. Outside, the wall was pre-dawn gray, invisible against a sky the same color. Who sent the raven? It came through the watch's own network, Southron Station, relayed north. Someone in King's Landing wanted us to know quickly. Jon turned back from the window. Varys, Stannis considered this without surprise. He had suspected it. He did not say so. The message does not identify its source. It wouldn't. Jon moved to the desk, which had yesterday's documents on it still, the corners weighted with stones he had placed in the night. "You said he is worth more alive. What is he worth to us?" "As much as a siege weapon," Stannis said. "If we move quickly enough that they cannot execute him before we have a blade at their throat, he becomes the condition of our mercy. If we move slowly, he becomes a body they display to demonstrate that our mercy has no value." He paused. "Robb Stark's host has assembled in the Riverlands, but has not yet committed to engagement." He set the message down on the desk. "That is the single piece of luck in all of this. Your letter can reach him while he still has full freedom of movement. After he fights, choices become obligations." "How long?" "At the pace we can assemble and march, 6 weeks to reach Moat Cailin. 4 more to the Riverlands. We have that window. Not much more than that." Jon looked at the documents, at the wall outside, at the single candle on the desk that had been burning since he placed it there 4 hours ago. The wax had run halfway down. "Then we write to Robb," he said. Now, Stannis drafted. Jon stood at his shoulder and read as the words appeared. The letter went through 3 versions in an hour. The first was too long. The second was long enough but began with a legal argument that Stannis correctly identified as starting in the wrong place. The Northern Lords were not persuaded by legal arguments, they were persuaded by blood and blade, and the clarity of plain speech. The third version was spare, brutal in the specific way that truth is brutal when it is not dressed. To Robb Stark, Lord of Winterfell. Your brother is not your brother. He is your cousin, and he is the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, born of lawful wedlock, the rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. He holds the proof. Your father is imprisoned by a false king who will not free him unless a true one demands it. The North cannot stand alone. The Crown and the North are one. We ride south from Castle Black within the week. Will you meet us at Moat Cailin?" Jon read it over Stannis' shoulder. He did not change a word. Stannis noticed this. He noted it the way he noted all useful information, without comment, permanently. "Seal it with yours," Jon said. "Not mine. He doesn't know my seal. He knows yours." Stannis looked at him. "He will need to know yours. He will. At Moat Cailin." Jon stepped back from the desk. "Send it with 2 birds. Different routes, in case one is taken." The ravens went out into the dark before the watch changed. Mormont found Jon at the post. Jon had been at it since first light, alone, working with a castle-forged longsword borrowed from the armory that was not quite the right weight and was not quite the right balance. Which was, Mormont suspected, the point. He was drilling the corrections, working the places where the wrong weapon exposed the weaknesses in what his hands thought they knew. Mormont waited until Jon stopped. "Lord Commander," Jon said. He had not turned around. He had heard the footsteps. Mormont came to stand beside him. He looked at the scarred post and the fresh marks on it, the pattern of them. The boy hit where he meant to hit. He always had. Even in the early weeks when the other recruits were still finding their feet, Jon Snow had hit where he meant to hit. "I have been thinking," Mormont said, "about what the Night's Watch is." Jon lowered the sword. He waited. We are an order that stands apart from the affairs of kings. That is the rule. That has been the rule for 8,000 years. Mormont's voice was deliberate, the voice of a man who has thought through a position carefully and is presenting it rather than working it out aloud. I cannot give you the watch, Jon. It is not mine to give. The men have sworn their oaths, and those oaths are their own. He paused. But I can give you the men who choose to follow. Not as black brothers, as free men. Volunteers, everyone who decides to take off the black. I will not name it desertion. I will not hunt them. That I can do. Jon looked at him. Why? Mormont looked at the wall above them, at the gray bulk of it against the sky, because whatever is coming from beyond that wall will kill every man, woman, and child south of it if the realm is not intact enough to face it. I have been sending ravens south for 3 years. He looked back at Jon. Not one has been answered. Not one. The Night's Watch needs a king who has stood on this wall and understood what is at the top of it. Go, Jon, take the throne, and then answer our ravens. Jon was quiet for a moment. How many will come? Enough to matter. Not enough to win a war by themselves. That's honest. It's what I have. Mormont looked at him with the expression of a man closing a transaction he has considered carefully and intends to honor exactly as stated. One more thing. Your direwolf. He glanced toward the far end of the yard, where Ghost sat in the shadow of the outer wall, white and motionless as a thing that had been carved there. The Watch doesn't keep pets. Ghost isn't a pet. No, Mormont said, looking at the direwolf. He's not. He turned and walked back toward the Lord Commander's tower and did not say anything further about the matter. They rode out at first light, 12 black brothers who had handed their cloaks to the man on gate duty and stood in the cold in their underthings, waiting for someone to bring them something else to wear, which Davos had arranged the night before with the focused practicality of a man who has learned that most logistical problems are simply clothing problems seen from the wrong angle. Plus Stannis' men. Plus Maester Aemon, bundled in the back of a cart that Stannis had obtained from the castle stores with a directness that had not involved asking. Because asking would have produced deliberation, and deliberation would have produced delay. Dywyn, the old ranging scout, stood at the gate and watched the column go. He had survived 30 years on the wall by the reliable method of knowing when something important was happening and staying quiet about it, and he stood there in silence with the expression of a man who would not be sharing what he thought about this morning for some time, and possibly not ever. Ghost moved through the gate alongside Jon's horse. Jon rode 100 yards beyond the castle and became aware of the white shape at his left stirrup and stopped and looked down. Go back, he said. Ghost looked up at him with the red eyes that had been looking at him from the floor beside his bed since the direwolf was the size of a boot. He did not move. I said, go back. Ghost sat down in the snow. The posture was not disobedient. It was the posture of a creature that has understood the instruction perfectly and has decided that understanding it and following it are different actions. Jon looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the wall behind them, at the gate they had come through, at the world to the south which was gray-white and vast, and entirely indifferent to what he was or was not. He turned forward in the saddle. Ghost rose and walked alongside his horse, and neither of them said anything further about it, and they rode south into the cold. Moat Cailin was 3 towers and the memory of a wall. What remained of the wall was crumbling in the particular way of things that have been crumbling so long the crumbling has become structural. Remove it, and the rest comes down. The towers were sounder, but only because the men who had built them the way the first men built everything, with the understanding that what they made would outlast them by a margin they could not calculate, and had better therefore make heavy. The great hall was the ground floor of the largest tower, which meant it was a round room with a ceiling too low for the great yawn, and a fire that could not decide whether it was adequate. It smelled of the neck, the damp, green, slightly sulphurous smell of the swamp that surrounded the causeway on both sides, the smell of a place that had been killing armies for thousands of years by the simple method of being exactly what it was. It was, Jon thought, looking at the room from his place at the table's head, a better room for this than a throne room would have been. A throne room would have required him to perform something. This room only required him to be present. The northern lords did not arrange themselves neatly. They arrived in the order their dispositions allowed, and sat where their rank demanded, and the result was a table that communicated, even in its seating, the particular difficulty of asking men who were accustomed to being the hardest people in any room to accept that there was a harder room than the ones they were used to. The Greatjon Umber was on Jon's left, which was where the Greatjon always ended up, because the Greatjon filled space the way weather fills space, not by choice, but by nature. He was enormous. He was scarred. He had ridden from Last Hearth in 9 days, which was 3 days faster than the road was supposed to permit, and the state of his horse had confirmed this. He had said nothing since arriving except to demand food, which had been provided, and to ask where the bastard was, which Jon had answered by walking into the room and sitting down. Rickard Karstark sat to the right, with the face of a man whose grief had cured into something harder than grief, and less useful. 2 of his sons had gone south with Robb, and he had not received word of them in weeks, and the not knowing was doing to him what not knowing does, turning concern into anger, because anger at least has somewhere to go. Roose Bolton was at the far end of the table. He was pale and quiet and watchful, in the way of things that are quiet not because they are calm, but because they have decided that silence is an advantage. He had said nothing since sitting down. His eyes moved between faces at intervals so regular they appeared almost mechanical. Stannis was to Jon's right. Davos, beside him. Aemon at the far end, his hands on the table, his blind face turned toward the center of the room, reading the room by its sounds. Robb Stark sat across from Jon. He had arrived the previous evening with 4,000 men and Catelyn Tully riding beside him, and Jon had heard the sound of the column coming in from the south road, and had gone to stand at the tower window and look down at it, and had seen his brother, his cousin, his brother, ride through the gate in half armor, with the auburn hair and the Tully blue eyes, and the face that was so familiar it produced. A pain that had no precise location. They had not embraced. They had stood 4 feet apart in the outer yard, while the column sorted itself, and looked at each other with the expressions of men who have a great deal to say, and cannot identify which piece of it belongs first. "You look the same," Robb had said. "You look older," Jon had said. "I've been marching a war. I've been finding out I'm a different person than I thought I was." Robb had looked at him for a moment. "Does it feel different?" "No," Jon had said. "That's the problem." They had gone inside. The Greatjon spoke first. He always spoke first when no one stopped him, and no one at this table was positioned to stop him. Robb Stark. His voice was the voice of a man who had been raising it over distances his whole life, and had never fully learned to lower it indoors. "I followed you to war for your father's head. I bent the knee to you as king in the north. Now you're telling me I bent the knee to the wrong man, and the right man is a Targaryen who spent the last 6 months mucking out stables at Castle Black." The fire decided at that moment to be adequate. Jon spoke before Robb could. "Yes," he said, "every word of that. Except that I spent the last 6 months learning to fight your men, not muck out stables. The Umbers trained me as hard as anyone at Castle Black. I assume they told you." The Greatjon had not known this. He had been told by his men privately. In the way men tell things they find worth noting, but do not want to seem impressed by, that the new steward at Castle Black had better instincts than any recruit they had seen in 20 years. He had listened, without connecting it to the boy across the table. He looked at Jon now with the reassessment visible on his face, which was the face of a man who does not hide reassessments, because hiding things has never served him. "You're Ned Stark's bastard," he said. Slower now. Not a challenge. A statement being tested for how solid it was. "I was raised by Ned Stark," Jon said. "Who I am is a separate question, and the documents on this table answer it. What I know is a third question, and I can answer that myself." "Then answer it." Rickard Karstark's voice from the right, flat and dry and not quite hostile. "What does a boy raised at Winterfell know about the North that earns him a room of northern lords?" Jon looked at him. The pass through the Mountains of the Moon at the headwaters of the Fever River runs impassable by the 3rd week of the 10th moon in a hard winter. In a soft winter, 2 weeks later. The next causeway sits above water by 4 feet at its highest point and 18 inches at its lowest, which means 2 men of average height wading in opposite directions can pass each other in the summer, and cannot in the spring thaw without one of them going under. He continued without pause. Umber horses winter range at a 12-mile radius from the keep when the fodder holds, and contract to 6 when it doesn't, which is the number that determines when your outriders lose contact with the column in November conditions. And the allegiances at the Fever River Ford run to God's law before crown law in every house that traces its founding to the Age of Heroes, which is all of them north of the Long Lake. He stopped. The great Jon looked at him for a long moment. Who taught you that? The Umber horses. My father. Jon held his gaze. The man who is not my father, who made it his life's work to ensure that if he was not there to protect the North, I could. Because he knew he might not always be there. Because he was that kind of man. He let that settle on the table alongside everything else on it. I know the North. I was made to know it by someone who loved it as much as anyone in this room. Whatever my name is, that does not change. The great Jon sat back. The bench under him registered the redistribution of his weight. He did not say anything further. He did not have to. The room had shifted the way rooms shift when the largest voice in them goes quiet by choice rather than by depletion. Roose Bolton spoke for the first time. His voice was very soft. The Lannister host is at Harrenhal. A simple contribution. Tactical. Offered without apparent motive, which was itself a motive. Tywin has 18,000 men and winter provisions for 6 weeks. After that, he moves or starves. We have less time than that, Stannis said. He will reach out to the Tyrells before the 6 weeks are gone. Possibly already has. The Reach's army is the largest in Westeros and it is currently uninstructed. Tywin will attempt to instruct it. Then, we move before it can be instructed, Jon said. Yes, the council went on for 2 more hours. Supply lines, march rates, the disposition of northern levies, the question of who commanded what and under whose authority and by what right. Stannis answered the logistical questions with the compression of a man who has done the calculations before the meeting and is reporting results rather than working through them. Jon answered the authority questions the same way he answered everything. Directly, without the performance of authority, which was more persuasive than the performance would have been. Catelyn Tully said nothing during the council. She sat behind Robb's left shoulder, which was not a seat at the table, there was no chair there. Which meant she had placed her own chair in a position that was present without being formal, and she watched the proceedings with the careful attention of a woman who has learned that the most useful thing she can do in a room full of men deciding things is understand exactly what they are deciding, and why. She looked at Jon twice during the 2 hours. He felt both looks without seeing them. When the council ended and the lords filtered out toward their billets and the fire had finally fully committed to being adequate, Jon remained at the table with the documents and the remnants of a meal he had not eaten. He heard the door open behind him and did not turn. He knew the footsteps. Robb sat across from him, the same position as during the council. The table between them empty now, no lords on either side, no one to perform for. My lords had been speaking of it for 3 days before your letter arrived, Robb said. He was looking at the table. They were going to name me King in the North. A pause. It had begun to feel like a real thing. I know. And then it stopped feeling like a real thing. I know. Robb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the neck breathed its swamp smell through the gaps in the ancient stonework. Somewhere in the distance a bird called once and stopped. You're my blood, Jon, Robb said. Whatever the rest of it is, you are my brother. Jon held his gaze across the table. Nothing changes that. Not a document, not a crown, not a name I was given at birth and never knew. Robb looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man memorizing something, the way you memorize the face of a place you are about to leave and may not see again in the same form. Then he pushed back from the table and went to one knee on the stone floor. He did not speak. He had said what needed saying. They both understood that the words for the rest of it did not exist in any language that either of them had been taught, and that the silence was therefore not an absence but a presence, the presence of 16 years of a lie that had made them brothers, and the truth that had not unmade them. Jon looked at the top of his brother's head. He looked at the wall's direction, north, through the ancient stone. He looked at his hands on the table, which were the hands he had always had, which had not changed, which had no idea yet what they were going to be asked to carry. He said nothing. Neither did Robb. The fire held. An army moves slower than any map suggests it should. This was the first thing Jon learned, or rather the first thing he learned that he had not understood he did not know. He had known the fact abstractly. Ned Stark had said it, Sir Roderick had said it, every man who had ever discussed military history in Winterfell's Great Hall had said it at some point, but knowing a fact and standing inside it are different experiences. The column stretched 3 miles on a good day and 4 on a bad one, and a bad day was any day when the supply wagons found soft ground, which on the King's Road in late autumn was most days. The horses ahead of the wagons churned the verge. The wagons followed the horses. The supply column bogged in what the horses had made, and the infantry waited, and the waiting was time. And time was the one resource they could not resupply at the next Waycastle. Davos rode beside Jon on the 4th day of the march and watched his face as the column stopped for the 3rd time before midday. "You are angry at the wagons," Davos said. "I am trying not to be." "That's worse, actually. Anger you don't acknowledge becomes the decisions you make at dusk." Davos adjusted his reins with the fingers that remained to him, which was not all of them. "The wagons are not the problem. The wagons are a symptom." "Tell me the problem." Jon looked at the column. "The ratio is wrong. Too many men for the supply chain behind them." "Correct. We have 11,000 infantry and 2,000 horse, and a supply chain designed for 7,000 in winter conditions on roads that are 3 weeks from freezing solid." Davos said it without accusation. He said most things without accusation, which was, Jon had concluded, the quality that made him more useful than any formally trained officer Stannis had. "So, what do we do? Reduce the column or increase the supply chain?" "We cannot reduce the column. We need every man at King's Landing. So, the supply chain." Specifically, Jon thought about it. Split the wagons between 2 routes. The eastern road through Maidenpool runs parallel to the King's Road for 40 miles before it curves. Send half the supply train that way. It relieves the pressure on the verge, gives us 2 parallel supply lines, and if one route is raided or bogged, we have the other. Davos looked at him. "Stannis suggested that 3 days ago. He was waiting to see if you'd arrive at it yourself. Did he say how long he was willing to wait?" "He said a good commander arrives at the right answer inside the window where it still matters." "You're inside the window." Davos pulled his horse sideways and started toward the supply column. "I'll arrange the split. You tell the column commanders before they lose the light." Jon turned his horse and rode. Stannis laid out the map of King's Landing on the campaign table and put a candle at each corner and waited for Jon to finish looking at it before he spoke. This was characteristic. He never explained a thing to a man who was still in the process of reading it. "The Red Keep sits on Aegon's high hill," Jon said. "The walls face the bay on the east and the city on the west and north. The main gate faces the city. Where is the weakness? The river approach. If those defending the bay entrance are engaged elsewhere, they will be engaged with the fleet." "Which is the point." "Continue. The fleet enters. The garrison rushes to the river walls." Jon studied the map. "And we come from the west. From the Kingswood." Stannis put his finger on the road that ran from the Kingswood to the King's Gate. "The garrison will have 3rd-tier men on that gate. The 1st and 2nd tier will be watching the fleet. They will assume the threat is in front of them, because the threat in front of them is very large and very loud. And threats that are large and loud are good at producing assumptions. They are the primary mechanism by which men produce assumptions in battle." "Yes," Stannis moved his finger. "The King's Gate has 2 weaknesses. The first is structural. The portcullis mechanism is operated from inside, and inside the gatehouse there are typically 8 men, which is enough to hold the mechanism but not enough to hold it against a determined force that has already breached the outer approach." He paused. "The second weakness is psychological. The men assigned to the King's Gate in a crisis will be looking outward, at the threat the city knows about. A cavalry force arriving from the Kingswood arrives from behind their attention." Jon looked at the candles on the map's corners. The light they threw was uneven. "A siege you cannot resupply ends in one of 2 ways," he said. "Assault or starvation. You design every siege so that your enemy is choosing between those 2 things, and both of them kill him." "You have been reading." "I've been listening." Stannis regarded him with the expression he used when something had confirmed an expectation he had not stated. Tywin is at Harrenhal. He has 18,000 men and 6 weeks of provisions. He is already composing his raven to Highgarden. He may have sent it. How long before the Tyrell host can march? 3 weeks to mobilize. 4 to 5 weeks to reach King's Landing from Highgarden by the Rose Road. Stannis straightened. That is our window. 7 weeks from the moment Tywin's raven lands. We need King's Landing before the Tyrell host arrives, or we are assaulting a city with 2 relief columns and a garrison, which is not a siege, it is an execution. Then, we don't let it become that. No, Stannis said, we do not. The lesson about Tywin came on horseback, which was where the useful conversations happened, not in tents, not at tables, but in the hours of riding when there was nothing else to do, and the mind had the particular openness of a man in motion. He will attempt to capture rather than kill, Stannis said. They were riding ahead of the column, alone, which Davos had arranged, and which was itself a lesson of a different kind. A commander who is never alone with his own thinking becomes dependent on the thinking of others. Tywin understands that a dead king is a martyr, a captured king is a negotiation, so he will try to separate me from the column, or draw the column into terrain that permits encirclement. He has been fighting wars since before you were born. He ended House Rain at Castamere. He took Pikey from the Greyjoys. He knows how to use ground to compensate for disadvantage in numbers, and he has had weeks in that castle to study every approach we are going to use. Stannis looked at the road ahead. He will use your Stark instincts against you. He will create a situation where the Stark thing to do is ride forward, and the correct thing is to hold. What's the difference? The Stark thing is to ride forward because someone you love is in danger. The correct thing is to evaluate whether riding forward solves the problem, or simply moves the problem closer to you. Stannis glanced at him. Your father rode to the capital because Robert summoned him. He rode into a room full of enemies because honor said you do not refuse a friend. Both of those things were Stark instincts and both of them were wrong. Jon was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved through the frost-pale light of an early morning that had not decided what kind of day it intended to be. Tywin will use Ned, he said finally. He will try. He knows I'll move for Ned. He is counting on it. Stannis looked forward again. Which means the most important decision you will make in this campaign is the decision you make the moment you learn that Tywin has positioned himself between you and your father. The Stark in you will say, ride. The king in you must say, hold, calculate, and find a third option that Tywin has not planned for. Do we have one? We are building it, Stannis said. That is what the last 5 weeks have been. Stop thinking about the battle, Stannis said. Jon looked up from the map. I wasn't thinking about the battle. You were thinking about whether you can beat the mountain that rides in single combat if he presents himself at the gate. You have been thinking about it for 3 days. I can tell because you keep measuring the width of the gate approach on the map with your thumb. Jon took his thumb off the map. Think about the morning after, Stannis said. He sat across from Jon and clasped his hands on the table, and his voice went into the register it went into when he was not instructing but stating. When the Red Keep falls, you will have 4 hours. 4 hours before the city fractures at its seams, before the servants start taking what they can carry, before the gold cloaks decide whether the man who paid them last is still a better bet than the man standing in the throne room. He looked at Jon steadily. You must be inside that throne room before dark. You must have a provisional prisoner manifest, a named warden for the city garrison, and a written assurance for the small folk distributed at every gate before the torches are lit. Jon absorbed this. You've planned this before. Stannis did not answer. For yourself, Jon said. You planned it for yourself. A long pause. The candle between them burned straight. The night outside was still. I planned it for whoever sat the throne, Stannis said at last, with a precision that was not quite evasion and was not quite honesty and was entirely Stannis. It was always the plan. Only the occupant was uncertain. Jon looked at him across the candle. What happens, Jon said, when I make a mistake? When I give the wrong order? When someone dies because I calculated wrong? Stannis looked back at him without flinching, without softening, without any of the reassurance that a lesser man might have offered, and that Jon would not have believed anyway. Then, you carry it, Stannis said. and you do not let the carrying stop you from making the next decision. Jon looked at the map. At King's Landing, sitting at the end of the road they were on, patient as a city is patient, waiting without caring who arrived. "We have 1 week," he said. "Yes, then we should sleep." "Yes," Stannis said. He did not move immediately. He sat with the candle for another moment, in the particular stillness of a man who has given everything he had to give today and is preparing, without theater, to do the same thing tomorrow. Then he rose and went to his cot. The candle burned on alone. They ran dark, no lanterns on the masts, no torches at the prow, no signal lights between ships, which meant communication was by arrangement made before the fleet left its staging position south of the bay's mouth. 3 short horn blasts for abort, 1 long for proceed. No horn at all because no horn was needed, and the plan was running as designed. The ships moved into the bay in a single column, 20 warships and the water between them. And the darkness above Blackwater Rush was absolute in the way of places where the firelight from the city does not yet reach. The garrison's harbor master did not wait for orders he was not going to receive in time. He deployed fire ships, 6 of them, old decommissioned hulks bought from shipwrights for exactly this contingency, their holds packed with pitch and dry straw. Their tillers lashed, and their sails rigged to catch the night wind off the bay. His men lit them at the waterline and pushed them into the current of the rush, and stepped back and watched them go, the oldest harbor defense available to a city, requiring nothing but combustibles and men willing to light and abandon. Stannis had planned for fire ships. He sent the 4 shallowest drafted warships ahead of the fleet, with orders to use grapples, poles, and cold water in whatever combination the situation required. It was ugly work. The fire ships moved with the current at a pace that required constant correction, and grappling a burning hull in darkness required men willing to accept proximity to things that were on fire as an occupational condition. 2 men went into the water when a fire ship lurched and took the rail they were working from with it. Both were pulled back aboard within minutes, blue-lipped and cursing. The fire ships were cleared. The fleet moved through. The city saw the fleet at the moment the darkness thinned enough to see anything. The alarm bells started at the eastern watchtowers first, spread west along the river wall in a pattern that said, "Men are alerting men, and each man is alerting the next, and no one has been told what the bell means, except that it is bad." The sound moved through King's Landing the way sound moves through a sleeping city, through windows and alleys and the ears of people who were not awake 30 seconds ago and are now awake and cannot quite locate the reason. The garrison ran to the river walls. 1st tier, 2nd tier, the gold cloaks with the most seniority, the men who had been posted to the river approaches because the river was where the threat was expected. The river was where a fleet would come. The river walls had the best coverage for exactly this kind of morning. They looked at the fleet. Stannis' warships had formed a line across the bay, pennants flying, the crowned stag visible in the early light, and they were moving toward the docks with the patience of something that does not need to hurry, because the outcome has already been decided. The garrison looked at the fleet, and the fleet looked back, and the 90 seconds that passed while both sides understood what was happening were the last 90 seconds in which any man on the river walls had his full attention on the river. On the docks below, the remaining wildfire went up. The dockmaster had ordered it deployed as a secondary defensive measure. Ceramic pots stored in the warehouse behind the dock moved to the catapults when the alarm bells rang. The fire when it hit the water was green and wrong and beautiful, and the garrison on the river walls saw it, and the garrison on the river walls watched it, and not one of them was looking west. Jon had been watching the sky since the 4th hour. The Kingswood at night was its own kind of dark, different from the sea dark of the voyage north, and different from the castle dark of Castle Black, a dark with texture in it, branches you could feel before you saw, ground that registered slight variations in frost density under the horses' hooves. 2,000 northern riders had been in the Kingswood for 3 days, which was long enough for the horses to have stopped being restless and short enough for the men to still be sharp. He did not need the signal. The sky told him. The wildfire's green was visible from 3 miles, not the fire itself, but its light, thrown up against the underside of the clouds in a color that had no business being in a sky. Jon saw it at the moment his horse did. He felt the animal register it through the reins, the small involuntary shift of a creature that has seen something its instincts do not have a category for. "Forward," he said, not loudly. The man beside him passed it back, and the man behind him, and the column began to move in the darkness with the particular sound of 2,000 horses transitioning from stillness to motion. Not thunder, not yet. Just the accumulated breath and weight of it finding its direction. The King's Gate faced west. The road from the Kingswood hid it from behind its own attention. They came out of the trees at a canter, which was not the pace that announced itself. The gate's torchlight showed 8 gold cloaks on the approach, and 6 more on the wall above. The 8 on the ground heard the horses before they saw them. They turned. They had 10 seconds to understand what they were looking at. Jon did not slow. The canter became a gallop in the 50 yards before the gate, and what 8 men do when 400 horses come out of darkness at a gallop is not fight. It is not a failure of courage. It is the body making a calculation that the mind has not been given time to override. They scattered. The gate held anyway. The portcullis mechanism was inside, and the gatehouse was stone, and the 6 men on the wall above were still there, and they had crossbows, and they used them, and 2 horses went down in the first volley, and 1 man. Jon came off his horse before it hit the ground, rolled, came up against the gate itself, back to the iron. Ghost went over the wall. He did not use the gate. He did not need the gate. The direwolf found purchase on the stone the way the stone had always been meant to hold something, which was not the logic of physics but was the only logic available, and he was over the parapet and among the gatehouse men before they had finished processing what they were looking at. Ghost did not kill so much as unmake the courage of every man within 20 feet of him. The white of him in the torchlight was the wrong white, not snow white, not cloth white, the white of something that should not exist, and has come here anyway, and has no particular emotion about any of this. 2 men went over the parapet, rather than be in the same space as it. 1 man dropped his crossbow, and pressed himself against the wall, and closed his eyes. The other 3 ran into the gatehouse interior. The gate opened from inside. The man who opened it was a gold cloak, who had been on the mechanism side of the portcullis when Ghost cleared the parapet. A young man with the face of someone who has just done the most important arithmetic of his life and has identified the correct answer, and the correct answer was to open the gate and step away from it. Jon walked through. The sound of northern horse on city cobblestones was different from the sound of southern horse. It was not louder or faster. It was the sound of horses that had been ridden hard through 7 weeks of King's Road in winter conditions, and had arrived at a city's stone streets and found them trivial. The cobblestones rang under them, with the clarity of surfaces that carry sound rather than absorb it, and the sound went through alleys and under doors and into the ears of the city's small folk, who pulled shutters and pushed children into corners, and performed the calculations of people who have lived inside city walls long enough to know that when armed men come through the streets at speed. The question is not whether to get out of the way, but which way out is fastest. Jon rode at the center of the column with Stannis's map in his head. He was not looking at the buildings or the people or the rising light above the rooflines. He was looking at intersections, at the alignment of the street against the map he had memorized, at the distance remaining to the Red Keep on its hill. He was doing mathematics, and the mathematics was working. Joffrey was on the walls. He had been on the walls since the alarm bells, dressed in armor that fit him well because Cersei had paid for it to be fitted perfectly, and ill-fitted armor on a king was a statement she was not willing to make. He was giving orders. The orders contradicted each other in a way that the men receiving them had learned to manage, not by following them, but by waiting for the second order to cancel the first, and the third to cancel the second and the fourth, to be something practical enough to actually execute. When the sound of northern horse reached the Red Keep's walls, when it became clear that men were inside the city already, that the gate had gone, that the fleet was in the bay, and the cavalry was in the streets, and both of these things had happened before the garrison fully understood either of them, Joffrey stopped giving orders. Cersei was at his shoulder before he stopped moving. Her hand on his arm was not gentle. It was the grip of a woman who has been preparing for this moment since the morning she understood that the walls of this city were only as permanent as the men on them, which was not permanent at all. "Inside," she said. "I'm commanding the defense. Inside." She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice with him when she meant it. Now, she moved and he moved with her because that was the mechanism that had always operated between them when she chose to use it, the one that bypassed everything else. The gold cloaks broke in 3 stages. The first stage was the men at the gates, whose men looked at the king's gate that had already opened and understood the message it was sending about how the morning was going to end. They put down their weapons individually, without discussion, with the practicality of men who had been paid to hold positions that no longer existed. The second stage was the men on the walls who could see the streets below, who watched the northern column move through the city without apparent resistance, and performed the same arithmetic the gate men had performed, and arrived at the same answer. The third stage took 90 minutes. The men who lasted 90 minutes were the ones who had done things in Joffrey's name that they understood would not be weighed charitably. They were right about that. But they were wrong about the alternative. By the time the sun was fully above the eastern wall of the city, the streets were quiet. Jon rode through them, toward the hill. Ghost walked beside his horse. Harrenhal from the outside was an argument. The walls made it. They were the tallest walls Jon had seen, taller than Castle Black's inner keep, taller than anything the King's Road had shown him on the march south, and they had the quality of walls that had been built by men who believed that if you made something large enough, it became permanent. Which was the kind of belief that produced certain kinds of greatness and certain kinds of catastrophe. The towers were warped, not by time, by fire. The fire that had melted them had been dragonfire, and dragonfire had opinions about stone that regular fire did not, and those opinions had reshaped the towers into forms that looked like something had grabbed them near the top and twisted without letting go. Inside those walls, 18,000 Lannister men were eating through their provisions at the rate that 18,000 men ate through provisions, which was a rate that could be calculated and had been calculated by Stannis to 3 significant figures. Jon stood at the siege line's eastern edge with the calculation in his head and watched the walls. Ghost sat beside him. The direwolf had taken to sitting at Jon's left side with the consistency of something that had made a structural decision. And the men of the siege line had taken to leaving a space there, automatically, whenever Jon appeared among them, which was often. Jon had learned, on the King's Road and through the taking of the city, that an army needed to see its king regularly, and not in the context of speeches. It needed to see him walking among it, looking at the same problems it was looking at, eating the same food from the same cook fires. This was not performance. He did not have the appetite for performance. It was simply what made sense, and it worked, which was the same reason Stannis did most things. Stannis was at the siege line's western edge with his maps. He was always at the maps. The flag of parley came from a postern gate in the eastern wall at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, which was the hour when the light was best and the sentries were most alert, which was itself a statement. Whoever had sent the flag understood that it needed to be seen clearly and immediately, and had thought about the conditions for being seen clearly and immediately, and had timed accordingly. The man who came through the postern gate was short. He wore no armor, carried no sword, rode a horse that had been chosen for its unthreateningness, a brown gelding of no particular distinction that moved with the resigned competence of an animal that had learned its rider would be doing unusual things. Tyrion Lannister pulled up at the edge of the agreed parley ground and looked at Jon. Jon looked back. Tyrion was smaller than the stories made him and sharper than the stories made him, which was the consistent pattern of people who had been described primarily by those who disliked them. His mismatched eyes moved across Jon's face with the speed of a man who reads faces the way other men read maps, for information, for route, for the position of things that are not labeled. "You are younger than I expected," Tyrion said. "You are shorter than I expected," Jon said. Tyrion looked at him for a moment. A small thing happened at the corner of his mouth that was not a smile, but was related to a smile the way a sketch is related to a finished drawing. "I was told you were Ned Stark's bastard. I met Ned Stark. You are more comfortable in your own skin than he ever was. He carried something for 16 years that I don't have to carry," Jon said. "That changes how a man wears himself." Tyrion studied him. "You took King's Landing without sacking it. Yes, the gold cloaks who surrendered, you absorbed them into the city watch rather than executing them, the ones who had not committed specific crimes. Cersei and Joffrey are in cells, not on spikes. Tommen and Myrcella are in tower rooms with a view. They are children. They are Lannister children. Tyrion said it without apparent feeling, which was its own kind of feeling. I am a Lannister child. Jon looked at him steadily. I know who you are. Then, you know what I'm risking by being on this side of the parley line without my father's knowledge. He paused. He would not call it treason, because he has never recognized me as fully his son, but he would have opinions about it. Why are you here? Tyrion looked at the walls of Harrenhal behind him, at the towers warped by the fire of dragons that had been dead for a century and a half. He looked at them the way a man looks at a place he has been trying to leave for a very long time. Because I am looking at a king who walked into the Red Keep and didn't sack it, he said. I have been waiting my entire life for a king like that. I was beginning to believe the position didn't exist. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. The water supply to Harrenhal's eastern cisterns runs from a spring source 400 yards north-northeast of the postern gate. There is a point where it passes through a culvert of old stone that is accessible from the surface. Block the culvert and the eastern cisterns are dry in 6 days. He held out the document. Jon took it. The supply convoys from the Westerlands come south on a road that passes through the pass at Nuns Deep, Tyrion continued. There are 3 convoys outstanding. The schedule is in the second column. The men guarding them are not Clegane's men. They are household guards from minor Westerlands lordships who were there because Tywin needed the route covered and didn't have better men available. They will not fight hard. And in exchange, Jon said. I want to be useful, Tyrion said. To a king worth being useful to. That is the entirety of my ambition for the moment. Which is perhaps the most honest thing I have ever said aloud. He paused. Also, I would like to not be in Harrenhal when the provisions run out. The rationing has already started. My father does not believe in rationing comfortably. Jon looked at the document. Then, at Tyrion. Your father will know you came here. Eventually, when it matters, yes, it will not go well for you. My father and I have a long history of things not going well for me, Tyrion said. I have had practice. He looked at Ghost, who had been sitting in silence throughout, and Ghost looked back with the red-eyed patience of an animal that was deciding about something. You're direwolf, Tyrion said. Does it always stare like that? He's deciding about you. What are the possible outcomes? You'll know when he decides. Ghost looked at Tyrion for another long moment. Then he looked away, which apparently was the outcome. Tyrion exhaled fractionally. Well, he said, that's something at least. Stannis blocked the culvert on the 7th day. He did not do it dramatically. He sent 8 men with the right tools and Tyrion's document, and they were back inside the siege line before the 3rd hour of the morning watch. The eastern cisterns began dropping that afternoon. By the 3rd day the drop was visible to the garrison, which was Stannis' intent. He was not trying to hide that he had done it. He was trying to communicate to 18,000 men what the shape of the next several weeks was going to look like. The supply convoys he handled on the 9th and 12th days. The first convoy's guards put up limited resistance, and then did not. The second convoy's guards saw the northern riders on the road ahead, and made the calculation that Tyrion had said they would make, and turned back toward the pass. The provisions in Harrenhal began to be rationed on the 11th day. Tywin's orders about the rationing were precise and fair, distributed by rank in the correct proportions, which meant the common soldiers received less than the officers, and the officers received less than the commanders, and everyone received less than they needed. Tywin was not a man who made mistakes about logistics. He understood that a garrison that starves badly turns into a garrison that breaks early, and a garrison that breaks early means a surrender on his enemy's terms rather than his own, and surrendering on someone else's terms was not something Tywin Lannister had practice with. He was going to have to develop it. Jon walked the siege line every morning. He watched the walls, and the walls watched back. Ghost walked beside him, and the men on the siege line watched them both, and said nothing to each other about it, but had the look of men who were thinking things they would tell their grandchildren. On the 19th day, the postern gate opened. Tywin Lannister rode out alone. No escort, no flag of parley, no ceremony of any kind. Full armor, the lion of Casterly Rock on his breastplate, his great war-horse moving at a walk that said the horse was following the rider's instruction, and the rider was in no hurry, which was the posture of a man who had decided something and had given himself fully to the decision and was not going to perform urgency he did not feel. Jon met him on the road, also mounted, also without ceremony, Ghost to his left. Tywin stopped 8 feet away. He looked at Jon the way he looked at everything, with the complete, cold attention of a man for whom looking is the precursor to understanding, and understanding is the precursor to use. "You look like a Stark," he said. "I am a Stark," Jon said. Tywin considered this for a moment. "You are a Targaryen with a Stark's face. There is a difference." "Perhaps," Jon said, "but the Stark's face is the one that wins." Something moved behind Tywin's eyes that was not anger and was not admiration. It was the expression of a man encountering an answer that he had not anticipated and is cataloging it for future use, except that there was not going to be much future for Tywin Lannister's use of it, and something in the expression said he understood this. "Harrenhal's garrison will stand down by the 2nd hour tomorrow," Tywin said. "You will find the castle's provisions in better order than you expect. I have maintained discipline on the rationing." He paused. "I have one condition. You are not in a position to have conditions. I am in a position to make the transition of 18,000 men either orderly or not," Tywin said. "A disorderly transition costs you time and men and produces incidents that complicate the narrative you are trying to build. An orderly transition costs you one concession that you were likely to make anyway." He looked at Jon with the flat certainty of a man who has been negotiating from weak positions his entire life and has learned which pieces of a weak position are still useful. Casterly Rock. The Lannister name. The house continues. Jon looked at him, at the walls behind him, at the garrison that was in there, 18,000 men who were someone's sons and fathers and brothers, men who had followed orders south and had ended up on the wrong side of a morning that began in a different kingdom from the one that had drafted them. "The Lannisters keep the rock," Jon said. "The Westerlands lordships that are currently yours remain yours. Your house name continues." He paused. "The political apparatus ends. The gold cloaks were a Lannister instrument and are now a crown instrument. The Riverlands holdings revert to the Tullys. Whatever influence your house has built in the city over the past 20 years is dissolved. You return to Casterly Rock and you govern the Westerlands. A great house reduced to a regional power. A great house that still exists," Jon said, "which is more than you offered Elia Martell's children." The silence between them held the weight of that. Tywin did not flinch. He had never flinched. But something in the set of his mouth changed in a way that might, in another man, have been flinching. "Accepted," he said. He turned his horse toward the postern gate. He rode 20 yards and stopped without turning around. "Guard your hand, your grace." His voice carried back on the still air with the clarity of a man who has spent his life making sure he was heard. "Stannis Baratheon is a good man. Good men are always being used by others." He rode back through the gate without waiting for a response. Jon sat on his horse in the road and looked at the gate for a long moment after it closed. Ghost looked at the gate too, then at Jon. Jon filed the warning where he filed everything, quietly, permanently, in the part of him that Ned Stark had built for exactly that kind of thing. Then he turned his horse south and rode back to the siege line. He refused the Sept of Baelor. Not as an insult to the faith. He said this clearly to the High Septon's representative, a thin man in pale robes who had arrived at the Red Keep 3 days after the city fell and had been hovering at the edges of every proceeding since with the patient anxiety of someone waiting for a conversation he is owed. Jon received him in the small council chamber and told him that the ceremony would not take place in the Sept, and that this was not a negotiation, and that the faith of the Seven would be treated with full respect by the crown, which was a better arrangement than the faith had managed under the crown's previous occupant, who had used the Sept the way a man uses a stage, for performance, not for prayer. The High Septon's representative bowed and left. The Red Keep's godswood was small, not small the way Winterfell's was, which was ancient and vast and dark with the dark of trees that had been growing since before the castle above them existed. Small the way things are small when they have been placed inside something much larger and made to persist there by the will of whoever kept cutting the grass and not cutting the trees. A single weirwood at its center, older than the Targaryen conquest of King's Landing, the face carved into its trunk worn by centuries of rain, to the point where the expression was no longer identifiable as any particular emotion, and had become simply the expression of a tree that had been watching the city built up around it and had formed opinions. Ned Stark had prayed here when he was in the capital. He had told Jon this once, not as information, as a confession, the way a man tells you a small private thing when he is trying to tell you a larger private thing and cannot find the door to it directly. Jon had been 10 years old and had filed it in the part of himself that kept the things Ned said when he was not being Lord Stark. He had not known, at 10, that he would one day be crowned in the place his father had prayed, the man who was not his father, the man who was. They brought Maester Aemon out in a chair because the walk from his quarters was too far for his legs, and they had stopped arguing with him about the chair 2 days before the ceremony when he made it clear in the particular way that very old men make things clear that he would be at. This coronation in whatever configuration his body permitted, and the chair was simply the configuration. Sam pushed the chair. His face had the expression of a man trying not to show that he understood the weight of what he was doing, which was the expression Sam's face defaulted to when the weight of things became too large for his face to process normally. The Godswood was not large enough to hold the full court. Jon had not invited the full court. He had invited the people who needed to be there, which was a different calculation. Ned Stark stood to the left of the weirwood, Robb beside him. Davos stood with the Northmen who had ridden from Castle Black, who stood with the Black brothers who had taken off their cloaks and were now wearing northern wool, and had the expressions of men who had not decided yet what they were. Stannis stood at the back, which was where Stannis stood at things, not in the center, not performing, but present and accounted for and fully aware of every person in the room. Barristan Selmy stood to the right of the weirwood in clean white armor, the Lord Commander of a Kingsguard that was not yet fully formed, present the way a man is present when he has finally found the post he was meant to hold. Ghost was at the weirwood's base. He had been there since before anyone else arrived. No one had brought him, and no one had stopped him, and the white of him against the pale bark of the tree was the kind of image that men would try to describe later and find they could not improve on. Maester Aemon's chair was brought to the center of the clearing. The crown was on the chair's arm. John Smith, a Winterfell man who had come south with Robb's column. A thick-handed, quiet man named Aldo, who had been making things from iron since he was 9 years old, had made it in 4 days from northern iron and a small quantity of red gold that had come from the Red Keep's treasury. It was not elaborate. It was not trying to be elaborate. It was heavy and plain, with a single band of red gold running through the iron at the crown's midpoint. The only concession to ornament, and the iron itself, was northern iron, which was a shade darker than the southern kind and had a quality of density to it that was not quite visible but was somehow apparent. It looked like something a man could wear while he was working. Aemon took it with both hands when Jon brought it to him. He held it the way he had held Jon's face in Castle Black's yard, not gripping, just present, reading by touch. His fingers moved over the iron and found the seam where the gold met it, and stayed there for a moment. "Northern iron," he said. "Yes, and the gold? From the treasury." "I didn't want Lannister gold." Jon paused. "I didn't want Targaryen gold either. I didn't know what I wanted until Aldo brought me samples, and I picked the one that felt like something a man could carry." Aemon was quiet for a moment. His blind face was turned toward the weirwood, with the accuracy of a man who knows where things are through some sense that is not sight. "Your father, your true father, wore a crown of red gold and rubies," he said. "Rhaegar, he was beautiful in it, the way beautiful things can make you feel the distance between yourself and them." He moved his thumb across the iron. "This is better." He placed the crown on Jon's head. It was heavy. Heavier than it looked. Jon had expected it to feel like something being put on him, and it did, but it also felt like something settling. Like the weight had been looking for a place to rest, and had found it. Aemon's hands were steady. "For the realm," Aemon said. His voice was thin and absolutely clear. "For the people in the streets who do not have names that anyone records. For the ones who have been living under whatever the men in the buildings above them decided they would live under." He lowered his hands. "For Rhaegar, who deserved a better ending. For Lyanna, who deserved to live. He paused. For the man who kept the secret and ruined his own honor for a child who was not his, and loved the child anyway. In the back of the Godswood, Ned Stark closed his eyes. Jon made the appointment standing, not sitting. He had looked at the Iron Throne when they brought him into the room, and had decided that he would sit on it when there was work to do from it, and not before, which Stannis, standing to the right, had registered without comment. "Eddard Stark," Jon said. Ned stepped forward from the assembly. He was moving better, the leg had been seen by 2 maesters in the past week, and the boot had been replaced with a proper one. He would carry the damage for the rest of his life, which was the kind of fact that Jon held in a part of himself he did not visit often, because the visiting did not help. "Warden of the North," Jon said. "Your seat, your people, your home." He paused. "Which you should have been permitted to remain in, which I cannot give back the time of, but can give back everything else." Ned looked at him. The gray eyes that were Jon's eyes, that were Lyanna's eyes, steady and full of the thing that had no name between them. The 16 years of it, the cost of it, the fact that Jon was standing here because of it, and the fact that Ned was standing here because of it, and the fact that neither of them would have it any other way. "Your Grace," Ned said. It was the only thing he said. It was the right thing. Jon looked at Stannis. Stannis looked back. He was wearing the same expression he had worn in the war table room at Dragonstone, with the 2 documents on the table, the expression of a man who has done the accounting and is prepared to honor the result regardless of what it cost him to arrive at it. "Hand of the King," Jon said, "because I need the best mind in the realm at my right hand. And because the best mind in the realm has spent his entire life serving the law without recognition or reward. His reward is this." He held Stannis's gaze. "A king worth serving." Stannis picked up the hand's badge from the table beside him. He pinned it to his chest. He adjusted it once. Then twice, until it was straight. He nodded. That was his acceptance speech. The grain reports were on the table. Jon was reading them when the White Raven came. It arrived at the window the way ravens arrive, without announcement, without ceremony, with the blunt insistence of something that has flown a long way and has delivered its message before and will deliver it again, and has no particular feelings about the significance of any specific delivery. Jon took it. He unrolled the small tube attached to its leg and read the message inside. It was 4 words. From the Citadel in Old Town, in the formal hand of the Master of the Ravens there, the kind of hand that is trained to be legible above all else and has achieved legibility at the cost of all personality. Winter has arrived. Officially, he did not move for a moment. He held the message and looked at the candle on the table and thought about the wall. He thought about Mormont's voice in the training yard. He thought about what it felt like to stand on top of 700 feet of ice and look north into the dark and understand, in the part of himself that was not capable of disbelief, that the dark was not empty. He took the message across the chamber to where Stannis was reading the same grain reports from the opposite end. Stannis read it. He held it for a moment. He set it down on the table between them. He was quiet for a long time. Not the Stannis quiet that was full of calculations. The other kind. The kind that came when the calculations were finished, and what remained was simply the fact of the thing. He looked out the window at the city below them, at the darkness of it, at the lights that made it visible, and the vast dark beyond the walls that made the lights matter. Then he looked north. The way a man looks at a direction when he knows what is in it. "We have won the throne, Your Grace," he said. Ghost was on the floor behind Jon, white against the stone. The White Raven was on the table. The grain reports were on the table. Outside, King's Landing was quiet in the way of a city that has been through a great deal in a short time, and has decided, for tonight, to rest. Now we must win the world. A pause. The candle held. Winter is here. Jon looked north through the window for a long time after Stannis said it. He thought about the oath he had sworn in a Godswood that was not this Godswood, in a life he had chosen that was not this life, in front of a fire and a wall and the black sky above both of them. He thought about what the oath had been for. He thought about the answer he had arrived at over 7 weeks of march and siege, and the particular education of a man being made into something by people who had decided he was worth the making. The Night's Watch exists to guard the realms of men. He was the realm now. He looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back with the red-eyed patience of an animal that had made its decision at a castle gate and had not revisited it since. Jon turned from the window. He sat down and picked up the grain reports. There was work to do. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.